Welcome back to the Farm Show here on Westplex Talk 104.5. So glad you joined us. Today is Saturday, September 27th. We just marked 2 months of doing the Farm Show here on Westplex Talk. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. You will see that in our 3 segments, we usually have our 3 segments divided up by content. So in our first segment, which we call A block, we talk about people and a little bit about policy. In our second segment, which we call B block, we talk a little bit about policy and often about production. Advice, insights from production experts, whether you're a row crop farmer or whether you're in animal ag. And then in C block, we usually talk maybe a little bit of production and then mostly about profits, whether that's publicly traded agriculture companies or whether it's what you can do on your farm and your operation to make a little bit more money. A good time to give a shout out to Brad Hildebrand, our station owner, and my co-host of the Brad and John Show, right here on Westplex Talk 104.5 every weekday morning between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. I wouldn't even know the phrases A block, B block, C block if it weren't for Brad Hildebrand. So big shout out to Brad Hildebrand for allowing us the opportunity to put the Farm Show on the air. Now, let's get down to business. B block. I said we usually talk a little bit about policy and then also production. In this segment, policy. This was a big week for ag policy in Missouri. If you go across Highway 70 to the Kansas City area, 2 big events this week took place on Wednesday and Thursday. The Ag Outlook Forum, which was put together by the Agricultural Business Council of Kansas City, as well as AgriPulse, I guess you could call it a news broadcast syndicate based out of Washington, D.C., really the hub for ag policy news coverage. Big meeting this week, the 24th and the 25th, so Wednesday and Thursday. The first day, Congressman Mark Alford from Missouri was there. And then the big headliner on Thursday, USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins. If you're looking for really good coverage of this event, not only should you go to AgriPulse, they do have a lot of stuff behind a paywall at AgriPulse, but you could also go to Brownfield. If you go to Brownfield Ag News and you look up Kara Hart, you'll find all of Kara's coverage. You could also go in the search bar and search for Missouri, and you're probably going to find most of Kara's stuff. You can go to brownfieldagnews.com to find out about that event. Now, concurrently, on the 24th and 25th, on Wednesday and Thursday, the United States Animal Health Association, in collaboration with the National Institute for Animal Agriculture, NIAA, also had a symposium on the New World screwworm in Kansas City on Wednesday and Thursday. So expect us to touch on that latter meeting. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about New World screwworm. Again, to find coverage of both of these events, I would suggest you go to AgriPulse and go to Brownfield Ag News. Now, on the topic of ag policy, particularly as it relates to animal ag, one Missouri company in the western part of the state has taken the lead in standing up to California's Proposition 12. And they made big news this week. The company is Triumph Foods. Here's what they had to say this week. Triumph Foods has filed a lawsuit against Proposition 12, aka Prop 12, a California law that bans the sale of eggs and pork unless they come from farms operated in a manner dictated by special interest groups' food preferences. This lawsuit includes claims never pursued by any plaintiff and expands the challenge against Prop 12 by the U.S. Department of Justice, which filed claims against Prop 12's egg provisions. Here's what Matt England, president and CEO of Triumph Foods, had to say. Congress has already acted and regulates pork production in our country. A national food supply chain depends on consistent regulation from the federal government, free from a patchwork of interfering state requirements. Triumph goes on to say, Triumph's lawsuit builds upon the company's approach against Massachusetts Question 3, aka Q3, where Triumph was successful in obtaining an order from the district court striking down part of that state law for violations of the Dormant Commerce Clause. The same unconstitutional provision exists in Prop 12. The claims filed against Prop 12 include that the federal government already regulates Triumph Foods and similar U.S. Department of Agriculture inspected facilities, and that states cannot add to and interfere with those regulated spaces when preempted by the authority of Congress. Triumph goes on to say, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously held National Meat Association versus Harris that Congress already has enacted legislation in this space, and that state laws that usurp the federal government's role and disrupt our nation's food supply are unconstitutional. So who is Triumph Foods, you ask? Triumph Foods is a leading processor of premium pork products worldwide. The farmer-owned company began operations in St. Joseph, Missouri in January 2006. With its state-of-the-art facility, Triumph employs over 2,400 workers and produces over 1.5 billion pounds of pork annually. For more information, visit triumphfoods.com. Now, for the first time ever on the Farm Show, we're going to play an audio clip from the good folks at the USDA. 2025 marks the 40th anniversary of USDA's Conservation Reserve Program, becoming a significant part in the conservation toolbox while providing a myriad of natural resource, recreation, and economic benefits. Rod Bain of USDA looks at CRP and its growth over 40 years in an edition of Agriculture USA. Have a listen.
What this program does is make it possible for farmers to take marginal land out of production so that you don't have erosion.
Former President Ronald Reagan when he signed the 1985 Farm Bill into law. The program he was talking about was the then newly established Conservation Reserve Program, which would pay farmers to take highly erodible land and set it aside for conservation. Now fast forwarding 40 years later, the head of the USDA agency that oversees CRP observes,
for 4 decades, CRP has provided financial and technical support to agricultural producers and landowners who place unproductive or marginal cropland under contract for 10 to 15 years.
I'm Rod Bain. Farm Service Agency Administrator Bill Beam and former Agriculture Secretary John Block joins us as we discuss CRP at the 40th anniversary mark in this edition of Agriculture USA. The Conservation Reserve Program has grown to become one of USDA's more popular programs in the so-called Conservation Toolbox. When the idea for the program was first conceived in the early 1980s, there was an uphill battle to get it into law. Former Agriculture Secretary John Block, a member of President Ronald Reagan's cabinet, discussed the genesis of the idea during CRP's 30th anniversary a decade ago.
We were setting aside some of the best land in the world. In order to have farm program support, you'd have to take out 10 or 15% of your ground, and some of it was really good ground. So my idea, well, if we're going to set something aside, let's do something that can protect the soil and get some of this fragile land out of production.
CRP's creation occurred when low commodity prices, increased land erosion and nutrient runoff, and farm foreclosures covered the farm landscape in the early 1980s. Secretary Block's idea involved payment to producers to set aside acres highly sensitive to erosion. The Secretary recalled in a 2011 interview with USDA Radio,
I took this idea to the White House and to the powers that be in the administration in 1983 and 84.
Late in 84, the Conservation Reserve Program was included in the proposed new Farm Bill. Opposition to include CRP in the Farm Bill came from the then Office of Budget and Management Director David Stockman, citing the program would cost too much. Block's diligence in securing funds for CRP through USDA led to its announcement at an Indiana farm spring of 1985. Learning later of the announcement, Stockman called Secretary Block. The Secretary's reply?
I said, well, tomorrow I'm going to announce the Conservation Reserve Program. And he was pretty furious about it, but I said, well, I'll do it anyway.
The Conservation Reserve Program formally became law when the 1985 Farm Bill was signed by President Reagan in late December of that year. 40 years later, the Farm Service Agency, which oversees CRP, conducted its most recent general sign-up, along with enrollment of acres into the continuous and other CRP categories. FSA Administrator Bill Beam says for 2025, USDA accepted
1.78 million acres, and that includes general sign-up, continuous sign-up, and grasslands, and the Conservation and Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP. About 25.8 million acres are currently enrolled in CRP. We received offers on more than an additional 2.6 million acres.
He adds,
producers submitted their re-enrollment offers on just over 624,000 acres and offered enrollment of new lands of just under 2 million acres.
And former Agriculture Secretary Block and other CRP proponents recognize the program's growing popularity with landowners beyond its primary focus as a natural resources conservation tool. Outdoor recreationists, from outdoor sports participants to those hiking along stream banks protected by CRP land, appreciate the program's benefits. There is the variety of cover crops planted on CRP land, some with potential as an energy feedstock, and much as part of wildlife habitat.
There's insistence that you've got to have the right kind of crops or foliage growing there and grass and legumes so that all of the butterflies and bugs and everything will have a habitat. It just turned into more than I ever imagined.
Details about the Conservation Reserve Program and its various offerings are available through local Farm Service Agency offices or online at www.fsa.usda.gov. This has been Agriculture USA. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Okay, that's a good primer on CRP acres, but what does it look like a little bit closer to home? Via Farm Service Agency data, the most recent year, which is 2024, the county in our broadcast area that has the most acres in CRP is Franklin County, 922 acres. And in that category, I should say in that total acreage, the largest category, introduced grass plantings. And we'll define these terms in just a minute. The county in our listening area with the second most number of CRP acres is Warren County with 411 acres. The largest category there is also introduced grass plantings. And the third, I should say the county with the third largest number of acres is St. Charles County with 184 acres. The largest is to native grass plantings. Now, uniquely, the data doesn't show any acres in St. Louis County dedicated to CRP. What's the difference between the CRP plants? Native grasses, which are categorized as CP2, are plants that naturally grow in a specific region before agriculture. Planting them is often a requirement for establishing strong wildlife habitat and supporting local ecosystems. So that's native grasses. What are introduced grasses, categorized as CP1? These are non-native species brought from other regions. They can be used for their specific benefits, such as providing nesting cover for birds or creating specific types of vegetative cover that support environmental goals. All right, and with just a few minutes left, I want to point out that the Missouri Department of Agriculture has just released a few new videos about dealing with black vultures. Are you dealing with black vulture fatigue? I'm going to play it real quick before we go to break. Have a listen.
Well, we've been involved in this, the black vulture issue for almost a decade now. We were the organization that went to Washington, D.C. and convened a hearing with Congressman Jason Smith as well as other legislative leaders throughout the country to bring recognition to this. It has definitely increased over the last few years as these birds continue to stay longer and not migrate. They're continuing to move further north. So it used to be we only heard from pockets of membership down in southeast Missouri and southwest, but now here in the Ozarks and even farther north, you're hearing more about the depredation.
Recently in the pasture we're standing, we had a problem with black vultures, and so what I did at that time to mitigate the problem was to use my UTV and harass them to drive them off. Then I got in touch with Davin Altoff at Farm Bureau, and Davin made it really painless to get the permit, and now we can take those by any means possible to mitigate the problem here on our farm.
There's a lot of different techniques and strategies that you can use to harass the birds in a non-lethal way to get rid of them. Effigies, hanging dead birds in a tree works, that's effective. You can get those effigies through the USDA, or you can get a permit, kill one, and do that yourself. You can also cut down roosting trees that are a habitat for these birds. If you see a lot of birds in one tree, it's time for that tree to go. Eliminate that habitat. So there's a lot of things that you can do in addition to getting that permit to help mitigate the issue. Very important for people to get their permits like Chuck has and to work with Farm Bureau. We worked really hard to make sure that Farm Bureau were able to be the organization that distributed those permits because of their county offices, and so people need to take advantage of that. I will add that, vultures in general are very important to our ecosystem. Cleaning up the dead animals is extremely important. The turkey vultures do a good job of that, so do the black vultures, but the black vultures have become more aggressive. Our mission is not to eradicate birds. Our mission is to help farm and ranch families prevent economic devastation, which can make the difference between the black line or the red line in a financial year.
Nonetheless, if they do land and they do harvest a newborn calf, the problem is economic. Obviously, $1,000 to $1,500 when that calf's weaned is what they're worth now. Not only that, perhaps the mindset that it leaves the producer with. It gets pretty frustrating, when you lose one. If you can find a way to mitigate it by harassment or whatever means possible to keep them out of here, then you avoid that frustration that comes on. You just got to be diligent. When you know the calving season's the time for them to come, then you've got to be out there checking. You just got to be.
All right, that was Mike Deering with the Missouri Cattlemen's Association in a video produced by the Missouri Department of Agriculture. You can find it at agriculture.mo.gov, more information, and you can also find the Missouri Department of Agriculture on YouTube. We will be back on the Farm Show, that's Farm and Ranch Missouri, here on Westplex Talk 104.5 in just a moment.